Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Florencia. Thank you to the SDG Academy, and thank you for everybody that is joining today's discussion. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and to discuss this new book, The Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. The purpose of the book is to gain some perspective on our fast-changing world by looking at the long history of human interdependence across the globe. I did not write it, of course, with a pandemic in mind, but there is no more global event than the one that we are living through now, the COVID-19 pandemic. And it also involves every aspect of physical geography, involving the initial events of the emergence of this new disease, the spread around the world, technology, how we combat the disease, the interactions of our responses with a new digital society, and our institutions, meaning our governments, our multilateral institutions, the role of organizations such as the World Health Organization or the International Monetary Fund in the context of this global challenge. So the book for me is a bit poignant that it came out just as this epidemic was hitting the entire world. Indeed, in the last 3 or 4 days before the manuscript went to printing, I was able to add a quick preface about the COVID-19 pandemic to note that global disease pandemics have played a huge role in human history, from the bubonic plague as one example that spread from Asia to Europe in the 1330s and 1340s, to the massive effects of old world pathogens on the populations of the Americas when Columbus and the European conquerors came in the last decade of the 15th century and throughout the 16th century, spreading conquest and disease, to the AIDS epidemic that hit the world in the 20th century, probably like COVID-19, a zoonotic event, meaning a transfer of a pathogen from animals to humans, probably in West Africa, probably sometime in the first half of the 20th century, and then spreading all over the world, and now COVID-19. So what we're experiencing in the massive disruption of our lives, the fact that I assume that almost everybody is at home, basically living now on our digital means, this is part of a long story of humanity, and how we react to this virus and how we surmount it and how we move forward is also a part of a long human story. The theme of the book is that the physical world, physical geography, where diseases emerge, where diseases have heavy burdens, sometimes in the tropics, sometimes in other ecozones, the mineral resources, the physical proximity of different regions through international trade, whether sea-based or overland, those physical geographic dimensions of the world interact with our techniques, our know-how, our tools and machinery, and with our ideas, our cultures, and our political and social institutions in complex ways. Of course, throughout known history, historians, economists, great sages have debated whether the changes on the planet are led by culture, by ideas, by individual persons, by underlying technological changes, by the nature of human interactions with the physical earth? My answer is all of those. The nature of global change is complex, and it is necessary to understand these three great domains of physical geography, technological change, and institutional dynamics in politics, in society, in culture, if we are to make sense of the complicated environment that we find ourselves in today and the world that is emerging, the new age of globalization that is emerging. I talk about globalization as deep interconnectedness of humanity over large geographic regions. And I note that globalization in this sense has been a core part of human history and prehistory from the very beginning of the modern human species. Indeed, from the time of our hominid relatives, even before anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens emerged. This has been a long story of globalization. I date the first age of globalization to the dispersal of modern humanity from the cradle of our species in Africa, and then a dispersal timed, it's presumed to around 70,000 years ago, from our African common homeland to all parts of the world. And that first age of globalization was an age of migration overwhelmingly by land on foot, and apparently to some extent by raft or other seagoing vessels to reach islands that constitute an amazing achievement and adventure of prehistory. That first phase of globalization was one also of interconnection, because even in prehistory, there's evidence of long distance trade, long distance movements of vital or treasured amulets and other materials that have been found in archaeological sites long distances from their place of origin. So even in prehistory, humanity was interacting over long distances. Civilization, as we know it, settled humanity, largely settled in agricultural sites, constitutes the second great age of globalization. And that is the age that commenced with the end of the Ice Age, the end of the Pleistocene, and the beginning of our geologic epoch, the Holocene. This occurred roughly 10,000 years ago. And at the time of that global change of climate, there was the underpinnings physically of the birth of agriculture, that is settled cultivation of plants and domestication of animals. That's the second great age of globalization, the Neolithic age, which I date from 10,000 years ago to around 3000 BC. At that point, incredible invention took place. One can call it an invention of almost modern transport, and that is the domestication of the horse and the domestication of other animals that could serve for long distance movement. But the horse plays an absolutely distinctive role in human history because the horse gives the capability to move over large distances with speed, to carry freight and people over large distances, and therefore to govern over large distances as well. It's the horse that makes possible the long distance empires, and domestication of the horse took place in Central Asia, probably between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, and created the beginnings of long-distance rule of empire. And I trace that during this third equestrian age. That gives rise to what we know as the Classic Age, the age of the Roman Empire, the Han Empire, the Mauryan Empire in what is now India, the Parthian empires in what is today's Iran. Great land-based empires that almost define in our imagination and in our histories what empire is. And that Classic Age, of course, is also the period where fundamental ideas of our civilization, the great philosophies, the great religions, the great cultural traditions such as Confucianism in East Asia take root and really make the ideas fundamentally of the world that we still know today. I date the next age of globalization to the transformative discoveries of sea routes from Europe to the Americas and Europe to Asia with the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, events which Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, called the two most significant events in the history of mankind. Adam Smith noted that when the Americas and Europe, or the New World and the Old World, were reconnected in 1492, and when ocean-based travel from Europe to Asia and back was made possible by Vasco da Gama's and other discoveries, this united the entire world more intensively than had been the case for 10,000 years, in fact, and had ever been the case in human history. And Smith wisely said when he wrote in 1776, hundreds of years after those events, that the full import of that globalization by ocean-based trade was still unfolding. Its deep consequences would not be understood, he said, for ages to come. And indeed, he understood the enormous transformative changes that took place in global civilization as a result of all regions of the world being united. And not united in common purpose or power or economics or wealth, certainly not, because the sea-based discoveries gave rise to the European-led world. They created vast misery, in fact, in the native populations of the Americas and the native populations of the Indian Ocean societies that fell increasingly under the domination, the colonial rule of European powers. But transformative it was. I date the sixth age of globalization to even to a date, one could say. If you wanted to choose a year, I would choose 1776. Not necessarily because that was the birth of the United States, though that was important, but because of another signal event at that time, and that was the patenting of perhaps the most transformative single technology in history for perhaps a couple of thousand years, and that was the steam engine. The steam engine is the fundamental transformer of society from an overwhelmingly agrarian and commercial economy to an industrial and post-industrial economy. The steam engine unleashed unprecedented resources of energy, the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, for use in movement of people, transportation, and freight, long distance shipments, but of course in industrial power, military power, and countless other fundamental changes that gave rise to the modern economy. Everything changes with the steam engine. And in the book, I show the increasingly well understood pivot of history that came with industrialization, because everything changed. The world economy started to experience sustained economic growth. Incomes per person achieved for the first time in human history sustained increases. The world population soared from around 800 million people at the time that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations to around 8 billion people today. So the transformation of society was profound and fundamental. What people do with their lives was more deeply changed by those inventions of the industrial age than any time before that, since the Neolithic revolution itself, the agricultural revolution. Humanity went from being farmers, about 90% of the population, to being today largely an urban global society, with the vast proportion of the population now working in industry and services rather than in basic commodities production. Well, my argument is that we have entered a seventh age of globalization. I wrote that before COVID-19, but COVID-19 has dramatically accelerated the changes that I was emphasizing in the transition from the sixth or industrial age to our new digital age. We've been in a set of fundamental transformations since the middle of the 20th century. These have involved geography, technology, and institutions. Technologically, the fundamental driver of our age is the digital technologies, the realization of the great thinker Alan Turing and his counterpart of the age, John von Neumann, that much of human activity, much of the world's information could be coded and computed as zeros and ones in a new digital technology. Turing wrote about universal computation in the 1930s before there were computers of the modern sort. But by the 1940s, using ideas of John von Neumann and pushed by World War II, modern computers were invented, developed, and when the transistor was invented in 1947 in Bell Laboratories, that gave a fundamental push forward to our digital age. With integrated circuitry, microprocessors, the invention of the internet, one could say the rest is history, though history is unfolding very, very rapidly. But we now live in an age that is shaped by digital technologies as fundamentally as the industrial age was shaped by the steam engine and factories. So this is the technological underpinning of our new age. Geographically, our new age is defined by environmental stress, or as is sometimes said, by humanity trespassing the planetary boundaries. With industrialization, with the massive increase of food production and therefore the carrying capacity of the planet to feed a growing population, we had, as I said, a tenfold increase of the human population and a massive rise, roughly tenfold as well, in the average output per person on the planet, or roughly speaking, 100-fold increase in total economic activity on the planet. That has weighed very, very heavily on our physical Earth, creating three interconnected, huge environmental crises: climate change, induced by the use of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emitting processes. Second, the mega pollution, which has hit our oceans and our soils and our air and kills millions every year in air pollution alone. And the vast destruction of biodiversity, largely through the clearing of land for new agricultural activities and cities, destroying vast swaths of the planet and the habitats of millions of other species, both terrestrial and marine. So that is the geographic definition of our new age, sometimes even called a new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene. The institutional change is the changing geopolitics of the world. There's one fundamental point that I hope my book emphasizes, and that is that in our interconnectedness, it is not the case that any one region of the world rules the rest by any birthright or any sustained process of dominance. In fact, globalization has been marked by many different regions having their moments of dominance, and by multipolarity, by different poles of the world at different times playing a dynamic role and also a role of conquest. Well, in our age, the industrial era was defined by Anglo-American dominance. First, the British Empire, with the advent of the British-led industrialization, dominated the world, and the British Empire was the great empire of the 19th and 20th centuries, and Britannia ruled the seas, as the expression puts it. The sun never set on the British Empire because it was far-flung and in all parts of the world. But with the rise of the United States economically, and with the advent of two devastating world wars and an intervening Great Depression, the British Empire not only was diminished, but it was largely dismantled after World War II. And the global dominant economic and technological and geopolitical leadership passed to the United States. And the US saw itself as global leader, and indeed christened itself as the head of the American century in the second half of the 20th century. My argument is that in this seventh age of globalization, we're passing from the American-led world back to a multipolar world, and especially one where East Asia, especially China, but also Korea and Japan and other countries of East Asia, are gaining tremendous technological prowess, therefore economic stature, therefore also military capacity and power capacity, and that this is creating a different world, not an American-led world, but a multipolar world where in the 21st century, different regions of the world, I believe and advocate in a regional cooperative setting, will share global power. East Asia, Southeast Asia in the ASEAN region, Africa through the union of the 54 African countries, the African Union, Europe, in the European Union, North America, Latin America, and so forth, I believe constitute integral regions of the world that will each have their relative power and influence, cultural domains, but which will continue to interact with each other intensively in this new digital, interconnected, and environmentally threatened technological world. So the book concludes with a couple of chapters of how can we get our act together so that we can cooperate effectively in a world where there is no clear leading nation, and indeed no need for one, if instead of a global leader, there is global cooperation in a rule-based multilateral system. I'm a fan of the United Nations, a great fan of it. I devote a lot of my time to the functioning and work of the United Nations. I believe the UN Charter provides the basis for global cooperation. And I believe that the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written and adopted in 1948, provides the moral charter for global cooperation because it signals the universality of human dignity, the universal rights of each person to political, civil, cultural, and economic rights. And the book concludes with the notion that in our new digital age, we need a strengthening and renovation of our multilateral institutions under the guiding wisdom of the UN and its charter and its Declaration of Human Rights. And that on that basis, we could confront our great common challenges, such as climate change. Well, we now face an imminent challenge that is extraordinarily dangerous, that is still unsolved, and that is containing the pandemic. In order for us to succeed in this effort, we're going to need global cooperation. We haven't seen a lot of it evident in recent months. Indeed, rather shockingly, the US government pulled out of funding the World Health Organization at the very moment when the World Health Organization is more urgently needed than ever before in stopping this pandemic. So we have a great drama. We have an acute crisis, a new geopolitical age, a new technological reality, and a great deal is at stake. I hope that the book can be helpful a little bit in enabling us to look back on the long history, on the benefits of interconnectedness, but also the risks when these ages of globalization give way from one to the next, and often are occasions of unrest and tribulation. We don't want that now. What we want is to be able to steer together a world towards sustainable development, social inclusion, environmental sanity, and that is the great challenge before us. I hope the book will be of interest to you, and I look forward to the discussion now. Thank you very, very much for the chance to be with you today.
Thank you, Jeff, for such a great presentation. And definitely we have a lot of questions here from some of your students as well as a wide audience. So just to build a bit more on your statement about the UN, there's here a question that says, what is the role of the United Nations in the 21st century? With challenges coming from populistic parties raising consensus to all over the world in their own countries, would it have to change governance and how governments have to adapt?
The UN is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year. It was established in 1945. It is in many ways the fruits of a vision of the greatest president of American history, Franklin Roosevelt, who was building on ideas of his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, who envisioned global cooperation under a universal body, which was the League of Nations in its first incarnation. But Woodrow Wilson's idea of a League of Nations did not succeed in helping peace in its time. The League of Nations was established after World War I, but because of deep political errors by Wilson himself and deep errors in the treaty that ended World War I that were pushed by several of the victorious countries in the Versailles Treaty, the League of Nations was not an effective instrument in the end for multilateral governance. And tragically, the United States never joined. The Senate rejected the treaty, and as a result, the institution was weak from the start and was not consequential in overcoming the unrest of the 1920s and 1930s, and therefore in preventing the outbreak of a new world war in the 1930s in the Pacific and then in Europe in 1939. So Roosevelt's idea was a United Nations that would work, and that was born in 1945. It is in many ways a wonderful vision and a wonderful reality in many ways. I adore it because it's a meeting place now of 193 governments. The governments don't necessarily like each other very much. This is huge cultural divides, very different levels of income, of technological capacity, of military capacity, of population size. Some countries, a few thousand people, and at the other end, China and India, each with 1.4 billion people. But it's a meeting place, and it's a place where, therefore, global agreements can be reached, such as the Paris Climate Agreement. And it is underpinned by a set of standards which fundamentally say solve problems peacefully, not by war. And that is the purpose of the UN Charter. But the UN Charter also, not by accident, gave special prerogatives to the US and actually to 5 countries that were at that time the allies in World War II of the victorious allies. So the United States, then the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, Britain, and France are the so-called P5 or permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the critical war and peace branch of the UN. And the special prerogatives of the P5 include 2 things. One, a veto power in the UN Security Council. And second, a veto power over any changes of the UN Charter itself. So this gives an extraordinary kind of conservatism to the UN in that it literally puts change into the hands of 5 countries. Now, those 5 countries have 2 characteristics. One, they want to preserve their special prerogatives. And 2, they're not getting along very well. They did not get along as soon as the Cold War started to develop, as early as 1945, in fact. And so we have 5 fractious superpowers with a hold on change that is needed in the UN system. One of the changes itself is representation in the UN Security Council, because the UN Security Council has 15 seats right now. 3 of them are Asian. That means 20% of the seats in the Security Council are Asian. only one of those 3 Asian seats is permanent. The other 2 rotate on 2-year terms. But 20% of the seats should be compared with 60% of humanity in Asia. So Asia is very much underrepresented in the Security Council. And to my mind, there's no doubt that India, for example, is least representative of all, because this is a country of 1.4 billion people, but it doesn't have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. So all of this is to say that the UN is a vital, I believe, life-saving and life-affirming institution, but it needs change. It's also a complicated institution because it means several different things. It means the Security Council, it means the General Assembly, it means the special UN agencies like the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN Education, Science and Culture Organization, UNESCO, and others, the specialized UN agencies and funds. It means peacekeeping operations. It means treaties like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's a lot, but it's also frustratingly difficult to act sometimes under the UN Charter, not least because of the special prerogatives of the 5 countries. Now it's all become even more difficult because the US, in the right wing of the US, which is now in power, has gotten it into its head that the UN is an obstacle to US power. And this is because of the extreme nationalism and often extreme militarism of the US right wing. And the result is that within US politics, the UN is also deeply contested. The American people like the UN. Roughly 70% of Americans in opinion survey after opinion survey speak very well of the UN. But the Republican Party regularly attacks the UN, and Trump vulgarly attacks the UN, even in his speeches at the UN itself, which I've attended over the years. So this makes it terribly complex because the country that founded the UN, the country that hosts the UN, is now attacking the UN at several points. And this recently includes the withdrawal of US funding for the World Health Organization, the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, threats by the US against the International Criminal Court, and so on. It's very complicated. We can't give up on the UN or its ideas, but we need to find ways to reform the UN and to reinvigorate the global support for the UN because of its vital role for our well-being.
Thank you, Jeff. Here, in this very complex scenario that you're pointing out when it comes to the UN, it's still extremely impressive that in September 2015, and 193 countries adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, right, with such a wide consultation with all of the sectors of society. So here there's a question in which dives a bit more about the pandemic that, as you said, is a very much product of also, or like a manifestation of this global world in which we live. So how the pandemic will affect the delivery and the implementation of the SDGs, in your view?
The pandemic is a huge, huge disruptor. We have hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of infections. In my own country, we have, as of mid-June, about 120,000 deaths, and a society that is deeply at odds about what to do. Some people in some places, some state governments say, just go ahead, open up. We can't control this thing. Others say we have to take strong public health measures to control it. I'm definitely in that camp. But all over the world, this is a fundamental challenge. It is under control in a few places, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. But even that control is tenuous you can stop the spread of the virus, but the virus moves stealthily. It comes in asymptomatic people traveling across international boundaries. It can be transmitted by people with mild or no symptoms at all. And so it's very hard to control, though the Asia Pacific region, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and others in the region have largely suppressed the pandemic, but not fully, of course. In Europe and the United States, the virus hit very hard. And now in South America, the virus is hitting very, very hard. And the future stakes are still very large because deaths have been high, but only a small proportion of the world so far has been infected. And the fight is to stop the rest from being infected and all the deaths that would follow that as well. This has to be done in two ways. One, by taking public health measures, for instance, quarantining people who are infected so they don't infect other people until their infections are over and it's safe for them to move around again. Taking hygienic precautions such as wearing face masks, which both protects the user with the mask and other people who could be infected by that person. And also the testing of people so that they know whether they're infected and whether they should be isolated and so forth. So public health is essential. And the other major step that is underway and needs to be promoted is the development as fast as possible of new medicines and, we hope, a vaccine in a timely way, and then to ensure that there is access for that, not just for the privileged few rich, but for everybody. So this is also an enormous challenge. Well, the final point I would make is that when this epidemic does come under control, and it will, we're going to face a huge rebuilding problem, lots of unemployment, lots of bankrupt companies, lots of people who have big debts, and companies and governments that have big debts as a result of this experience. And we're going to need a shared way out of this. And that's where the SDGs are really going to play a huge role of giving a framework. How do we build back better? How do we build back not by going back to our old, dirty, polluting ways, but to clean, renewable energy-based ways? How do we use the new digital economy that we've been thrown into headlong in recent weeks and months to develop the best of telemedicine, the best of distance education, as we're doing right now, using digital means for global webinars and discussions, e-governance, participation by people in government through the internet, and so forth. So this is where the SDGs can play a huge role in helping us to have a more effective solution, even after the epidemic is controlled, so that we don't have this happen again.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Actually, there is a question here diving exactly in what you were just talking about, the importance of digital technology and artificial intelligence, data analytics, communication. Could you dive a bit more on how tech can support the delivery on the SDGs?
I absolutely would be delighted to, because I'm a technophile in general. I like technology. The whole book is about how technological changes have moved forward better ways to produce, communicate, transport, compute, and so forth. And this is human progress. The book is also replete with examples of how technologies have the dark side. One, of course, is that they're militarized constantly, because if we have more powerful ways to do things, we also have more powerful ways to fight each other. And now we're entering a new era of threats of cyber warfare, destabilizing infrastructure of other countries, space warfare, and it's just horrible what comes into the imagination of human beings when we should be using technologies for the common good. So I've long believed in the Millennium Development Goal period of 2000 to 2015, and now in the Sustainable Development Goal period, that the digital technologies are hugely beneficial. A lot of poverty, for example, is about isolation. People who live in rural areas far from urban services, they couldn't get a birth certificate or a driver's license or access to a bank account. But digital changes all of that. You can be online, you can have telemedicine, you can have e-education, you can get government licenses online immediately, rather than having to move 100 kilometers to a district capital. You can make payments, have e-commerce, and so forth. So this is a huge, huge advance potentially in bringing us together. So the question for us is, how do we use this technology, not frivolously, not to make fake news, spying, surveillance, Facebook or others selling my personal data, but actually to use it for solving sustainable development goals. How do we use it for environmental monitoring, satellite readings every day to help us fight deforestation, illegal fishing, and so forth? How do we use it to fight an epidemic, whether it's smart Bluetooth-enabled technologies to see if you've been in proximity of people who are infected with the virus? That's one idea. To more mainstream ideas of information management and public health tools that are online and help people to stay safe in the midst of an epidemic. Korea has been a great exemplar of a country that has used digital technologies effectively to fight the pandemic. One huge challenge in the pandemic is that not everybody's online. And so when schools quickly went online, poor kids couldn't do so. They didn't have the tablet, they didn't have the laptop, they didn't have the wireless at home. They didn't have the means to quickly shift online as people of higher incomes did. Universal access, therefore, to digital technologies to prevent the digital divide becoming even wider is paramount. And now that we see the digital technologies more and more are really human need, because everything that is important, whether it's health or education or government services and so forth, are now online. We have to have the idea that digital technologies themselves are now essential services. And it's been proposed by the wonderful CEO of Verizon, Mr. Hans Vestberg, who's a great leader in sustainable development, that SDG 18 should be created as universal access to digital technologies. I'm in favor of this idea. Digital has become so central to the delivery of public services that we really should promote their universal access and the development of applications for the common good.
Wonderful. Jeffrey, we have, as you know, you inspire many of learners from around the world with these SDG Academy courses. They're wonderful testimonies of how your courses have been so helpful to for them to understand better the world and find ways in which they could act on the SDGs. Here we have a question by one educator that says, during this global crisis, they found some trouble sometimes to try to explain and motivate and inspire their students and especially as a global citizens, how they can have future hope and action for the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I think that we should all take inspiration and also responsibility to overcome this crisis and to build the world that we really want to build together. And this disaster this is history that we're living through, and young people live through it should be empowered to understand what's happening, and should be empowered to think creatively about how they can contribute to their community, to their school, to their family, to overcome the epidemic itself, and to promote sustainable development. People ask me all over the world all the time, what should I do to study for contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals? And I tell them, first, almost anything you study, whether it's public health, or whether it's economics and finance, whether it is business, whether it is philosophy, whether it is science or engineering, they're all part of the solutions for sustainable development. This is such an interconnected reality. Of course, it's geography, technology, and institutions. It spans just about everything. If you also consider that institutions include culture, ideas, ethics, and so forth. So I always encourage people, follow what you're interested in, but be interested in contributing to global solutions as well, and align with the globally agreed commitments, whether it's the Paris Agreement on climate change or whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, to keep an orientation. These global agreements are very, very important because first, they reflect a common interest of humanity. After all, 193 countries that don't like each other very much signed up to this. So it shows that there is a common interest in this. And second, it is by setting a common goal, we set a common direction and therefore know better how to contribute to that common direction. And so knowing the SDGs or appreciating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think is very empowering for us. It helps us to understand, okay, we're part of humanity. Here are ways that we can share in the adventure constructively and creatively of all of humanity.
Wonderful, Jeff. And we're almost at the hour, but I couldn't imagine any other way to finish more inspirational and more for a call for action. So thank you so much, Jeff, again, for this wonderful presentation and for your work. We're very pleased one more time to have this webinar with you. Just a couple of things before we close. We want to remind everyone that they can access and they can read the Ages of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. They can purchase it or also enroll at the Globalization Past and Future course that we had with Jeffrey Sachs a few years ago, and keeps gaining enrollments. So one more time, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Thanks to the SDG team, Academy team, for helping to put this together. And Jeff, once more time, delightful to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Florencia.